my earliest involvement with music was when I was playing on a piano at my parents' house. That's really where it started for me. And everywhere I went as a kid on vacation or whatever, to my aunts or uncles, there was always a piano around. It seems like everyone in my family had a piano. I'm not sure why that is, but there's pianos everywhere. So whenever I was, bored or, at one place for a long time, I would just find myself sitting at the piano trying to figure out this instrument. So that's like my earliest, and after that, as far as structuring music into full tracks, that was the Commodore 64 and Commodore Amiga. When I got one of those, I was so excited that I could take all those ideas that you playing away at a piano, but you can suddenly put them into full tracks. You can add like percussion, you can add bass, you can add arrangement, you can have the theme. And before, when you're playing on a piano, you're quite limited to to two hands. So that was super exciting to me, that you could actually put stuff in a sequencer, and then you could listen back, and you could sit back and not having to play anything, and the music would play. So that's the beginning for me.
Were your parents musicians as well? Or?
No, not really. My dad played the trumpet, as a hobby, but there was a fiddler in my family. Some 150 years back, he was like a guy who would walk around neighboring towns and play the violin, that kind of thing. But so basically, very little, but I was very encouraged by my family. They helped me buy my first keyboard and everything. They were 100% behind all the music making I was doing, and I think they saw it too. When I got a computer, I would just sit in front of that computer and play video games and make music. But both of those things came at the same time, and so I would make like a track a day, and in my teenage years, and just every day I had to make a song, whether it's on the synthesizer or it was on the computer. It was just always there, and I think they understood that I was completely addicted to music making.
So you actually just played computer games and like turn off the volume and then make music over it?
Actually, I wouldn't say I turned off the volume when I played games, because I was so fascinated by music in these video games. On a Commodore 64, which is the first time in my mind that a computer had a real sound chip. These are the prior computers like PC and stuff. They could make these beep sounds, but it was very rude sounding. But the Commodore 64 had an analog chip, music chip, and it actually, to me, it felt like this computer had a soul, because of the music it was able to, bring out. And there were some composers on that format that really grabbed that and ran with it. And that's the chip music, the SID music, that even to this day it's still being created. Which is,
do you remember the very first game that the music really spoke to you and I want to do this?
I don't know if I remember the first game, because there was a bunch of games, I think the games with Rob Hubbard and Martin Galway, a lot of those games like Commando and Green Beret and Parallax. You would sit there and you would listen to the title track, Knucklebusters, and that had like a 12-minute main title track, and you would just sit there and it would just go on for 12 minutes, and it went all over the place, and you could just tell that this composer was having so much fun, was grabbing his, how do you say, was taking control of the fact that he had creative freedom, because if you're on a main title and you're at minute 12, you're kind of like, you can almost do whatever you want, because, now we're, that just doesn't happen anymore. There was more, I think the composers were giving a bit more freedom back then, because video games were so new. Game designers didn't really understand the medium fully and how to get the best out of the music. That was usually asked of the composer, and so the composers would usually run with that. And these days, it's a lot more complicated. There's a lot more knowledge that we've gained over the years about how can music benefit a video game. But back then, we were all breaking new ground, I think, and that was just fascinating to me. I listened to so much of that kind of music. I loved it.
What were some of your favorite video game soundtracks, just in general, back in when you were first starting in the gaming
Back in the day, Whizball is probably one of my all-time favorites, and also the game was just amazing. It was a game where you played a wizard and you had to color the world, so you had to collect colors and it was a very interesting concept. And you know, just Parallax was another game that was really fun. Parallax was like a very early open world type game, which used parallax scrolling. You know, when you have scrolling going at different speeds. It's one of the first games to do that. Yeah, I could talk about that all day.
Did you ever like compose something and then send it off to the developer just to see what they thought of it?
I think at that time it was too early. You know, I was like 13 and I was just trying to figure out how to create music. I wasn't even trying to create good music. I was just trying to figure out how the hell do you do this, you know? And so I remember my dad bought a music program and I was fiddling around with it, trying to figure out how to use this program. But then I was introduced to the demo scene, and that's where a lot of innovative programs come from, but they kind of come from the underground. They're not really released to the public. They stay within the demo scene, which is a bunch of people, you know, creating demos and programs that's not really made for, you know, profit, you know. So when I found one of those programs, that my brain exploded, and I was suddenly introduced to this whole world of high-quality music making on the Commodore 64, and that's when it really kicked into gear for me, you know. And I never thought I could do this for a living. Honestly, I always just it was always a dream, of course, but I never, you know, when you're 13, you don't necessarily think. You don't have it all figured out yet, you know, and looking back at it now, I can see that that was definitely a path for me that I was taking, but I don't think I was aware of it yet. I just knew how much I loved it, you know. I actually, you know, tried to get into film school. That was my first, you know, and then I was like, I always made music anyway, so I was like, well, and then we started a game company, you know, with my friends, and I became co-owner of a game company, and since then, it just was full time, you know.
What was that game company?
We were called Syrinx, and our first game was Subterranea for the Sega Genesis. We sold that game to Sega, and after that they brought us over here, or we moved over here to make more games, you know. So
was that your first game experience, or did you have games before you made your
I had a little something before, but you know, some of those projects were canceled, or some of them were just a single track, you know. But that was my first. Subterranea was my first title where I was able to do a full score, a full like 90-minute or something like that score. I wasn't really introduced to the game industry through Syrinx and Subterranea, because that was our own company. You know, we made our own games, and we had a company called Scavenger that would publish our games. So we were very much just, you know, within our own team making games. Once Syrinx was dissolved, and I decided to stay in the US, and my friends went back home to start IO Interactive. So once I stayed here in the US, that's really when I felt I was introduced to the game industry, because suddenly I was working on like MDK2 for BioWare, and Messiah for Shiny and Interplay, and also Hitman for IO Interactive. And that's when it really felt, okay, this is the game industry right here. There's suddenly I'm out there, you know, instead of being with this team of friends, you know.
What was that general feeling like of like, I'm finally making music for what I really want to be doing?
It was a great feeling, because it was, when Syrinx was dissolved, it was heartbreaking, you know, because we had delivered the games that we needed to deliver, and they had been sent out to the market, and there was a lawsuit afterwards because people didn't get paid, you know, the Scavenger didn't get paid, the publisher, and they finally won the lawsuit after 5 years. But of course we had moved on since then, you know. So we very much felt like we had done our part of the bargain, you know. And so that's why it was particularly heartbreaking. But it was a great feeling to come out of that, you know, hole that you're in when everything seems to be going well, and then everything is just gone. Literally, it felt like from one day to the next, you know. So it was an extreme shock, I think. And so when I, you know, resurrected, you know, myself, it was a nice, very nice feeling, you know. And I felt like I had a lot to offer. So I was very excited that I was able to start working on such great titles like MDK 2 and Hitman.
Can you give me like a little timeline of when you started really working in the games industry?
Well, Subterranea came out in 1993, and Hitman came out, I believe, in 2000. And so 2000 was the year when things really started moving for me. Yeah, Hitman was a game, was IO Interactive's first game. And that company was funded by a lot of the same people that I was in Syrinx with, which was the game company I was a part of. So it very much felt like an extension. It was a natural extension for them to create IO Interactive and Hitman. So I know these people very well. We grew up together, and so having done so many soundtracks for them already. I also worked on Sega Saturn and on a few games, for these same people. So they already, I came into this experience with them already knowing my music style and knowing what I was all about, and they knew that experimentation was a big part of my process, and that's what I try to do actually with all my scores, is experiment a lot and try to find something interesting and new, and then bring melodic and hybrid elements back into it, but always trying to find something new and something different. So that was what they were looking for as well. They wanted to really engage that kind of process and just set me loose as much as possible. And so Hitman 1 was written with a music system called Direct Music, which was a Microsoft interactive music system. But it was such a difficult program, and it was so like dry and database driven that I simply had to write the music just in my studio and then try to convert all that music into the system, because it was, like I said, it was just not a creative platform like these days where you're making music with sequences that are very creative to work in. Hitman 2 was the Budapest Symphony Orchestra and the Hungarian Radio Choir that we work with. And I had actually never written any orchestral music at that point, and I was encouraged by the CEO of IO Interactive, Janos Flosser, and also all the founders there. They were like, "Oh no, you can do this." And I'm like, you sure you have the right person?" So I started writing and studying orchestral music at that point, and finished the score, and was completely surprised at how much fun it was to work with a live orchestra. It was a difficult thing to write that music, considering I didn't really know anything about orchestral music much. But I guess I knew more than I thought. I was probably being hard on myself, but I hadn't really been set loose in that arena before. But then, being in a big concert hall with a huge orchestra and choir, and just hearing how everything that we had planned came together, it was just mind-blowing. And that was really when I was like, okay, I gotta do this some more. This is this is something I'm going to, want to pursue further, and I did. Then along came Hitman Contracts, which was a very dark chapter in Hitman, really, really dark. And it wasn't that much of a challenge for me to go dark. I'm not sure what that means, but I went there, and it was a very electronic score, and also a quite experimental score. I don't know if anything quite like that had been written before for a video game. I remember reading a lot about that and how people were surprised of how this kind of music would fit a game, and since then, of course, people have gone there. And then Hitman Blood Money, which is a project where I was able to do what I really wanted to set out to do on Hitman Blood Money, was to mix the orchestral with the electronic. And so that was the aspect. We all liked what Hitman 2 as an orchestral score gave to the series, and we all liked the electronic stuff and what it did for Contracts. So how do we put that together?
Yeah, it seems like that theme kind of stuck with the franchise going forward too, is the orchestral mix with the synth.
Yeah, it's and it was also inspired by a very kind of operatic, aspect and classical aspects, which is the first time I mean, there was traces of that in Hitman 2, like with the Hitman main title, for example, Hitman 2 main title. But I really got to explore that further on Blood Money, and also a very experimental score, I think. Even to this day, there's some pretty far out stuff in that score. And at the same time, there's tracks like Vegas, which to this day I really enjoy listening to, which has this like really, gives you a nice feeling when you're exploring a casino and you're like, okay, I'm thinking about doing something bad, but I haven't done it yet. You know, and it sort of just encourages you, that music encourages you to explore. And then when you do explore and you find a way to gain access to some place you're not supposed to be, the music just totally changes, you know, and it becomes much more interior. And that is the overall arc I was going for with the Hitman scores, was something that felt very interior to Hitman and its perspective of the world. And that's why there's so much darkness in that music. But there's also a bit of hope, you know, like I have in most of my scores. But still, lots of darkness in that score, and really an interior mindset, you know. It's not so focused on locations only. It always drives back to Mr. 47 and his personality. So yeah, Hitman definitely jumped-started my career. You know, when Hitman 2 came out, I was that's the first time I worked with a big live orchestra and big choir, and I started work on that fairly soon after Hitman 1. And that was so much fun to be able to suddenly record with a live orchestra. That was my mind was open very much to that whole world. And after that, I also did like Freedom Fighters and Hitman Contracts and Hitman Blood Money, and then it started with the Assassin's Creed 1 and 2 and Brotherhood and all that stuff. So yeah, I would say Hitman was a springboard for me. Yeah.
I think Assassin's Creed 2 made you a household name though for gamers, at least. Music
Probably, yeah. If you have to pinpoint a title, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What made that soundtrack just so special? What you think?
Assassin's Creed was, well, that was just such a mind-blowing experience to be part of. When they showed me the early designs of what they were trying to achieve with this game, I was like, this is crazy. You know, you have this giant open world, and you can look anywhere, and you'll be able to reach that point. You know, I had never seen anything like that before. You know, there was, you know, Grand Theft Auto was playing around with that idea, but you know, I think Ubisoft was the first to do it with in the style of more like a platformer, open world, you know, kind of thing, and that totally blew my mind. It was a difficult score to write in the sense that it was a lot of music. There's over 3 hours of music there, and I also had to, you know, be very much aware of the time period, since it's the Third Crusades, you know, very tragic period of the human history. I love the fact that Ubisoft was diving into something so real and historic with this game. I felt, wow, this is not something that a lot of people are working on, you know. So I wanted to be very truthful to that. So if you go to like the city, if you go to Jerusalem and we have music like City of Jerusalem, it had to really emphasize that spiritual, religious feeling that you know, people you know, had at that time and still have. But I think religion back then, religion 1,000 years ago or so, meant more to people, I think, than it does now. People were just less distracted by cell phones, you know. So we really wanted to dive into that. And another aspect that came up was mysticism, which I think have a huge inspiration on the score. It's something I really ran with. You know, the more I dug into the world of and the meaning of mysticism, the more I was like, wow, this is something really interesting here. So those were the things I focused on for Assassin's Creed 1.
So how do you like compose a piece of music for a game like this, and you know it fits?
Well, how do you compose a piece of music for a game? Well, I mean, first of all, you have to go further back. You have to find the style of the score, you know. And by finding the style of the score, you're looking at things like the setting, you know, and not just where is it, but what time does it take place. You're looking also at how does the gameplay feel, you know. Does it feel like this game encourages you to explore a lot, or is it a full-on action game? You know, that also you know, takes into consideration the pace of the music, you know, how the music breathes, you know. And then, of course, the storyline is the number one thing you think about, you know. And I always try to find things in my music where, how can I express something that we might not necessarily see or expect when we're playing this moment? Because if you're playing a moment and it has a, you know, it has an emotional resonance already, then you don't always have to play into that, because you know, that scene might already be emotional enough, and if you put music that's expected on there, it will make it more emotional for sure. But if you can find a way to score something that you don't necessarily see, but you're perhaps scoring the background story a little bit, like if you're in a dungeon and we're in Darksiders 2, you know, we might not get the sense that there's an afterlife here that we're exploring. We might just get a sense that we're in a dungeon. So if I can score it from a perspective of, well, I'm reminding you that the afterlife is out there, you know, beyond these walls, that's something I'm always looking for. How can I make the experience deeper that way, so that when you see what you see, you also feel it, you know what I mean? And you don't just feel dungeon, you know, or darkness, but you feel something more than that. That's what I'm always looking for. I do a lot of research when I do work that has historical setting, you know. And I try to stay away from looking at sheet music. I do, you know, listen to arrangements and stuff, but it's one of those things. You don't want to study those arrangements too much, because then they're going to start showing up in your music, and that's not what I'm about, you know. I like to come out with my own version of what that could sound like. So in a case like Assassin's Creed 2, I had never listened or didn't even really know what Renaissance music was. It was not something that was ever on my radar, you know. And it's, yeah, and I also had, you know, Ubisoft was also not looking for something that was just purely Renaissance music, you know. You didn't, you know, they didn't want to play the game for 20 hours and just listening to Renaissance music. There was something more that they wanted from the score. It needed to have a more current sound, an updated sound. So that's something I studied very carefully about, you know, and I ran into all kinds of interesting things I found out. Like, for example, opera music at the time of the Renaissance was you know, was there, but it was mostly comedic opera, you know, which is a genre that we don't really listen to anymore. This barely exists, you know. So I couldn't really go and write comedic opera music. It just wouldn't work. But obviously then I would embrace the world of the opera sound and just do my own thing with it, you know. And so you look for stuff that you can use, but I don't like take entire, you know, I don't lift entire things. I need to just take what I can use, and then I give my own spin on it. And that's what I try to do with all my scores, you know. I think a lot of my music, pretty much every score I write is different from the last score I write, you know. And so there's a sense there that I'm trying to reinvent myself and reinvent my sound for every score that I work on, you know. That's
a lot of people say when they listen to your music, like, every track sounds different.
Yeah.
So that's why people really enjoy your music.
Okay, cool.
As far as, like, you know, when people do listen to your music, you go online and see all the positive reception, all that, like, what goes through your head when you see that?
Well, I'm you know, thrilled about it, because it's not always that you know if what you're writing will resonate with people, and that's honestly not what I'm thinking about either. You know, I'm thinking about the project that I'm scoring and how it fits within the context of the project. You know, but when you see it resonating with people like that, that's just an awesome feeling. You know, and especially on Darksiders 2, it's such a unusual score, especially for a fantasy game, that to see that and the way it resonated with the fans and the press too. I mean, I was just really blown away that people got what I was aiming for with that, because I thought it was such a deeply personal score. Hey, you're scoring the afterlife, and you get and we want something unusual and unique. You know, that's basically the brief, and it's like you can't just sit down and phone that one in. You know, you really have to get in tune with yourself, and it has to come from somewhere. And so I felt it was a very personal score. So when reading about the reception for that score, that was really, that was awesome.
How, like, what's the most challenging soundtrack you've ever worked on?
Probably Assassin's Creed 1, you know. We had to come up with the sound of the Animus, you know, and the way the Animus filter all the different music, and puts a spin on all the music, you know, because we are inside a simulation. And that was something Patrice was very interested in bringing out in the music, you know. And the most challenging cue from that score was probably the chase music, you know, which on the soundtrack is called Access the Animus, which is 3 different pieces put together into one. And so there was basically the 3 levels of chase, you know, the slow, the medium, and the fast, you know. And that we worked on for a while, just to get that really perfect. And the chase scene was very important to the team. That's something they really worked on. And I think even to this day, chasing around the rooftops in Assassin's Creed 1 feels great, you know. It's a really good gameplay balance that they were able to find there.
How long do you spend on the average track, from writing to?
Yeah, well, it really depends. You know, sometimes creativity strikes immediately, and you're able to just sit down and write the track. Like, for example, you know, there's a track on Darksiders 2, which I just sat down and it was basically a live jam, and it happened very quickly. You know, you can do it in a day or 2. Other times you're fickling away, trying to find the, you know, the perfect theme or the perfect way for the track to respond to the situation you're scoring for. And sometimes you can spend 2 weeks doing that. I mean, you would go back to other music, and then you would go back to this track again. Then you would write something else, and you would come back with a new perspective. So it really can be almost anything, you know.
Do you have some favorite memories of just working on specific soundtracks that you'd like to share?
Well, I mean, I think,
teams you worked with?
Yeah, I think Assassin's Creed 2 remains my favorite project that I've worked on. I think there was such a positivity within that team, and everyone in the team, I felt, knew that they were part of something special. It really breathed that sense. And the fact that when I was shown the first early tests, it was all about atmosphere and lighting and romantic, you know, essence, and you're like, romantic. This is such a rare, you know, thing to be thinking about when you're making a huge AAA game, you know. But that's what the early test was very much in that direction. And I thought, wow, this is really something else, you know. My music is going to have to be really moody, which is still my favorite genre to write in, when I really can go and create atmosphere and mood and get like a sense that it's something that makes you feel something deep, you know, whatever that means, you know.
How much music do you create that actually goes unused?
Well, that depends on the project. Yep. Usually, most of the music gets used, you know. I would say usually there's like maybe 1 or 2 tracks that doesn't get used. But of course, other times you can be part of an experience where midway things suddenly change completely, and they decide to do something that feels very different. That hasn't happened much to me, but for the most part, I'm able to, even if something doesn't get used, find a way to get it in there eventually, you know, because if it's still written as part of the session that you are when you're creating the soundtrack, which the session is a 3 or 6 month session, you know, writing session, then it's like it came from somewhere, and it came from within that world that you are in at the moment. There might not be a moment in the game or the movie where that moment is, where there's a scene for that moment, but that doesn't mean it doesn't feel like that game, you know? So often I'm able to take things if it doesn't get used and find a way to get it to work.
Sure. So looking at your credits after, I think the release of Assassin's Creed 2, your credit section just starts to fill up real quick. How difficult is it manage like so many projects? I mean, even this year you're doing what, 4 different projects?
Yeah, and there's still some stuff we can't announce. It is a challenge, you know. For a while there, I walked around telling myself one of the most difficult things is to balance your schedule. But I don't like to look at it like that anymore. I think I figured out how to balance it pretty well now. And you know, I think one of the ways that you have to think of it is that there is no way you can avoid overlapping projects. You know, you get on board a project, you sign up for it, there is a time frame, and how often does that time frame actually get moved around, especially in the game industry. You know, it happens, and so you're like supposed to start another project at this date, and this project is supposed to be done, but suddenly it's still ending. So there's sometimes a little bit of overlap, and I think once I got to terms with there's going to be a little overlap here and there, I could sleep better at night. You know, in the beginning I felt, oh my goodness, you know, I'm still doing a couple of tracks here, I'm doing a few here. Everybody does it. That's how it is when you're a composer. You can't avoid it, you know, unless people are telling you all these deadlines are going to stay on cue. And if they did, great. But you have to be flexible. You have to go where the team goes.
You spend a lot of time making your music here, or do you actually go to the studios?
I spend a lot of time doing it here. This is my writing room, you know, and then we go record elsewhere. So, you know, I have a place close by I like to go record. And it's this is where I write most of the music. Yeah, well, all the music. I was taught the piano, and I studied the piano as a kid, but it was always as part of other studies. So it was in my spare time, you know. So I wouldn't say that I've grown up mastering an instrument. You know, that's for sure, that I don't really feel that. But I do feel that's kind of a strength, because I'm not afraid of trying to learn other instruments, you know. And so I like to play all kinds of things, you know, whether it's like a dulcimer or a santur or a piano or fiddling on a guitar and creating some terrible sounds. But it's just fun, you know. And you know, if I need a really good guitar performance, I have, you know, people I work with, they can express my theme in a beautiful way. But that doesn't mean that, you know, me fiddling with instruments won't give me some ideas, you know. So that's what I use live instruments for when I play them. It's often to get ideas and to use them to write music with. And then I like to leave it to the professional performers, you know, to help me express the theme.
So you've been creating music a long time. How much is, like, I'm assuming the technology has just changed a lot over the years?
Yes, it has changed a lot. But, you know, the funny thing is that something like this is all based on 1960s technology, you know, with the way these things, of course, it's been totally modernized, you know. But this, you know, most of this core technology was invented in the 1960s. A lot of the equipment in here is from the, you know, the 70s. I really like the sound and the effort that went into making sound back in the 70s. It felt like they were on a mission to make something that was the ultimate sounding thing, like the CS80 or a Prophet 10. And these days, it's much more about portability and price. You know, that's the two main focuses today. Of course, you still have big, expensive modular synthesizers, but you know, I don't know if they give you something really new. It's more like a retro thing, and that doesn't really have that much interest to me. I look for ways to use equipment from the 70s in ways that they would never think of using it back in the 70s, and then blending it with modern elements and live performances. I think there's so much untapped potential in those instruments made back then, you know. Like some of these keyboards would cost the same as a luxury car back then, you know, and you just don't see that happen very often these days. You know?
How come you don't think people use them?
Well, first of all, they're expensive. Yeah. They really are, and they're very difficult to find. And also, when you do find one, you have to think of it as this instrument is maybe 40 years old, you know. So, but that's part of the charm too. That if 40-year-old instruments would sound completely different than if Yamaha, for example, was to redo one of these instruments now. Not only would they have different components, but also the age that has been applied to all the components inside makes it sound unique. It makes it sound different than any other instrument. It's like with age, these instruments actually become more charming, I think, you know.
So with orchestral scores, do you not hear it until you actually get it in front of an orchestral, and then like you shape it from there?
I do hear it. I do mock-ups, you know. I have to use, I don't really find composing an orchestral score on a piano gives you the full scope, you know, because the piano is, even though it has a wide range, it can go very deep, it can go very bright, and everything in between. you know, there's so many flavors of the orchestra that you're not really, that you're kind of missing if you're just sitting with the piano. That's my, you know, I'm sure other composers would disagree with that, but that's just my personal way of composing. I like, if I'm writing for a flute part or a woodwind section, I like to use flutes and woodwinds to hear how it actually sounds. And then that can then inspire me to write something else for the string section. You know, so the music constantly inspires me as I move on inside the music track. I don't sit at a piano and kind of think it all through and have it all planned out, you know. Music, you know, inspires more music for me, you know.
So what's it like to, you know, compose a soundtrack for a game, go back and play the finished project and see your music in there?
That's cool. I love playing the games that I scored, but often I get to, you know, see so much of the game as I'm writing that a lot of it is spoiled already, you know. But I mean, it's definitely, I think, with the Hitman games, that was always so much fun to see, because I would be writing things for hypothetical situations that they were saying that you could do, and I wasn't necessarily able to, you know, to see it or play it, you know. But then to see it finally finished in the game was so awesome. But I did play those games a lot though while I was writing the music, especially Freedom Fighters. That's probably the game I played the most out of any of the games I worked on. I would play that game over and over and over while I was writing the music. And you know, all this choir music we recorded for that game it's not all something that was totally planned out from the beginning. It happened as I was playing the game, and I was like, let's do this, let's do that, you know, and let's make this really about the propaganda, you know, because that game is all about propaganda, you know. Not everybody understood that, but that's what that game is at its core value, I think. We gotta tap into this whole propaganda thing, and that's what I feel the score was able to really tap into.
When you're not playing video games, listening to video game music, recording, composing, what do you like to listen to?
Yeah, I like to listen to a lot of film music, and I really like the early Jerry Goldsmith and John Williams, and also classical music, you know. I try not to listen to too much of the current music. I like to have my own spin on things and make sure that when I deliver a soundtrack, it has its own vibe, you know, and it's not just tapping into with you know, with whatever's popular at the moment, but it has something extra as well. You know, it's just something in my DNA that I like to deliver something that I myself find I don't know, challenging, I guess. You know, I like to challenge myself constantly. That's how I feel. For me, I can grow as an artist, is to keep challenging myself. So this is the CS80. That's a synthesizer I've used on a lot of my scores. It's probably the most famous for being the synthesizer Vangelis uses in his scores, including Blade Runner. And it has some really, really nice sounds to it. See if I can get some audio on here. It has it has this ribbon controller, which is a very interesting device. Let's see if we can. Which is a pitch bend. Let me see. Turn that off. So you can actually play the instrument with this thing if you. I'm not any good at it, but. You know, I know like Stevie Wonder is one of the best people I've heard to play this ribbon bend on a CS80, where he would just jam with this and with this, and it's supposed to be incredible. Put some reverb. I mean, this is very dry without the reverb. Mm-hmm. And so you can add some reverb on it. And then I like to add some more reverb on it. Let's try this one. So, you know, then it has these really interesting modulation features, which, and it has some really cool ring modulation too.